There's nobody there yet, but you're welcome to join in. Yes, there are a handout for the class, and there's a link to that on the web page as well. But I'll also put it on share screen.
All right, so I didn't. What she's currently sent me here is and it's a real long URL.
Yeah.
Just hers, or should I get on it?
No, that just use that. And,
So
that should do it.
So I didn't need to register.
Yeah. If you have trouble getting on, call me and I will say something to Ashley, who I think is going to be the staff host.
Do you ever like meet with people outside your house, sitting in the dark, 10 feet away, mask on, just chat?
Oh, no, I haven't. And there's not really a good place here to do that. I would be fine, visiting with people, but I'm happy to do it at the synagogue, like outside the building.
Well, this would be fairly social, just to see how you were doing, but I would love to keep it. I'm trying to,
What's on your mind these days, Daniel?
Nothing. It would be just, what's up, dude?
Well, I'll tell you, not a whole hell of a lot. I mean, we're fine. I'm keeping busy, and Toby is keeping busy with the store, and Shaya's working, and his job is going very well, so that's really good. It's good for him to be working again, and it's also going very well too, so that's great. And our house is coming up. It is scheduled to be finished, barring any problems, late July. It's on schedule. And yeah, so, unless there's a problem with bad weather or with having, workers who wind up being out sick or something, specific people that they need for specific chores, I think it's going to be done on time. Then comes the bills.
Yes.
But,
We always have
yes. However, I don't think that it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be a problem. Yeah, we'll have a punch list, and yeah, we're going to have an outside inspector do a run through as they are finished. But I'm very optimistic that it's going to go very well.
So I'm trying to get into that site.
I see you. Is your webcam on?
Yeah, I opened it up.
And, well, looky here. There's Dell and Barbara Coleman.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hello, Rabbi. Hello, Rabbi.
Yeah. So anyway, I will talk to you later. Well, I don't know why you can't. Thank you. Bye. That was just my attempt to assist someone who wants to get in tonight. So we'll see how that goes. How you doing, Dell? Dell, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Well, I think Barbara's unmuted also, and I didn't want to echo.
Oh, well. And Daniel, you appear to have changed your name.
I think I'm
ask
using,
the same.
no, I think I'm using her invitation. And I think this is going to keep her from being able to go in. I think I needed to register to get my invitation.
Well, yeah, you should register.
But I don't. Let me go offline because I don't want to keep her from being able to join.
Yeah, she might resent that, you know.
Yeah, well, it's not fair. So let me do that, and I will try to register and get in using my own ID.
Yeah, whoever's handling the as host tonight should be able to get you in fairly quickly. Okay?
Okay. I'm going to figure this out. Right now, I'm going to get off.
Well, good luck to you.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. And if I don't get in and get to participate, I will next week.
Just
Bye.
do it. Just do it, Daniel.
It makes things a little bit more complicated than they have to be.
Yeah, it is. Is it always like that?
With Daniel?
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like,
Hi, Bob. Good evening.
he don't have any audio.
Yeah, you sound like you're about on half audio.
Dell put his webcam on tonight.
And he looks pretty good too, and except for, the fact that he and I have one thing in common. We're getting a little shaggy. That is a problem that you, Bob, do not apparently share. Bob is not talking to me.
First thing I plan on doing.
Yeah, all right, he's listening to me, but he's not talking to me. I can't read that. It's strange. He's not muted, but I can't hear him anyway.
Can you
Maybe
hear
he
me?
needs new speakers.
Can you hear me now?
He needs new speakers, perhaps. I don't know.
You know what? I think he's used the phone before for his audio, and that might be it, Tim.
Well, you guys are on early tonight. I know why I'm on.
Well, that way I didn't get on late this time.
Hey, Daniel, you made it. Evening, Francois.
Hi.
Hey there.
Hi. Yes.
How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm good.
Perfect. Good to hear.
You're gonna join the Museum on Saturday? Lori's reading Haftorah.
Oh, I'm definitely gonna be. I'm in.
Okay, good. Let's just see you there. Well, you know, your face on Zoom.
We'll be there.
Okay, good. Should cheer him on. Hey.
All right, I just need to check something here.
He now got himself on. Gabby's doing this today too.
Am I being heard? Don't take it over. Along. Am I being heard? They can hear me. Okay. Wait, hold it in the corner.
Somebody's recording.
Hey, you want to say hi to everybody? Huh? You can stick your tail in there if you like. Okay. So. No? What's the matter?
I can't wait till tomorrow.
What's tomorrow?
The barber shops will resume their businesses.
That's right.
That's right.
Are you going to be first in line?
Right.
And that they're not coming back till the 18th of May.
Oh,
But
well, that's bad.
Francois, you got to wait until Lag
Yes.
Bomer. So you can make an appointment.
Okay.
Yeah, I know I need to.
I cut my hair actually a week ago.
Yeah.
So it's very obvious that I cut my own hair. But I had to do it.
But it was a valiant effort, Francois. That's what really counts. Hey, Anna.
Hello, it's good to see everyone.
Hi.
Good to see
Hi.
you.
Hi.
And you're you. You have your face instead of Daniel's face.
What?
I didn't catch that.
I didn't catch that either.
Yeah.
I said that you have your face instead of Daniel's.
I used the link that you sent me, and when I got into the meeting, it had your name instead of mine.
Oh, okay. Because I loaned Daniel my my link. Okay.
But then I went off to and found the right one. Everything's fine.
Bob, you are not being heard, at least not correctly. I could barely make out what you asked, but yeah. And there's tremendous feedback from your computer.
Tomorrow's Pesach Sheni.
Well, it came and went.
We've got a
So,
seven. If you look at the list of participants,
Bob,
they're in separately.
you really need to mute.
What?
Rabbi, send him a text message. Go to participants and send him a note.
Maybe you should write, maybe
I'm
you
actually
should
counting
mute
as two
everyone,
participants.
Rabbi.
They got the phone is, that's our phone number. The phone is, that's our phone number. 713-340-6727. We're like two participants.
Hello, Ashley.
Hello?
Everything okay there? You need to mute Bob Cushman and his phone. But okay. Okay. All right. Well, now we can really get started and learn something. So, I'm going to put our text for today on share screen. And there it is. So here's the verse that I wanted to start with tonight. The verse says, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions." Now, just take a look at the verse and tell me what's the problem with this verse. This verse has a definite problem. What do you think it is? And take yourself off mute and tell me.
He doesn't say what are the fixed times. It says these are my fixed times. What does these refer to?
Okay, but that's not really the problem, because it's going to give you, in the rest of the chapter, it's going to give you a list of the holidays, right? So that gets taken care of. It would be a problem if it didn't tell you what the fixed times were, but subsequent verses will solve that for you.
We're asked to declare
English
the
is clumsy.
times, but they're God's times.
Just one at a time. Michael?
We're asked to
that you?
declare the times, but then they're said they're God's times.
Okay, so it says they are God's times, but you shall proclaim them. Right?
Okay, so my
Does
thought is
everyone see the contradiction here? These are my
I don't.
times, mine, God's. Right? They are God's times, and I'm going to give you a list of them, but you shall proclaim them as sacred occasions.
He's using man as his voice rather than proclaiming himself. He's having man do these.
Okay, that, Barbara, you may be correct, but that is an interpretation. That is not said in the verse. That might be a perfectly legitimate interpretation, right?
Because the you is not capitalized, so you is referring to an ordinary man rather than a.
Okay. In Hebrew, of course, there are no capital letters.
You know, Rabbi?
The translation and the capital letters therein are part of the interpretation of the verse. But even if they weren't, just the grammar would tell you they are my fixed times, but you shall proclaim them.
It's also singular.
Yeah.
Amarta.
It's different here because it's not, God is not commanding us to proclaim them as, he is not commanding us to treat them as sacred occasion. He wants us to claim them. Like he wants us to just, it comes from us to claim them as sacred occasions.
Proclaim, there are different things, Francois, but most of the sages who actually enumerate the 613 mitzvot of the Torah do include this as one of those mitzvot. All right? That you shall proclaim them as sacred occasions. That's considered a command. Right?
So Rabbi, are you saying that God is asking is this Moses? Yes, right?
God says to Moses, speak to the Israelite people, etc.
Right. So is God saying that he should be the one who with the authority? Is he the one that the authority
not so much the authority. God is still the authority, but he is telling Moses to pass this on to everyone. Okay?
There are
So when it says,
there is a tone here to me.
One at a time, Daniel.
There's a tone here to me.
I'm going to take this down so I can see all of you.
Yeah, are we
Daniel.
supposed to raise hands, or what's the rules at this point? Okay, so there is
just raise your hand or chat me. Yeah, Daniel.
Okay, I have a feeling my voice is really, really delayed here. There is a sense in the sentence to me that proclaim is part of a covenantal kind of relationship. It's God's rule, which makes sense to the universe only if we observe it. Is that something I'm reading into it, or does the Hebrew imply the same thing?
Well, it's not wrong just because you're reading it into it. Okay?
Okay.
Might be a perfectly legitimate interpretation, or, even an attempt to resolve the problem. But before you try to resolve the problem, you got to see what the problem actually is. And the problem is, it says, these are my fixed times, but you shall proclaim them. So Rashi sees the problem. Rashi sees the problem and speaks to it very clearly. He says, yes, they are my fixed times, but you have to proclaim them. And what are the conditions under which the Israelites proclaim the festivals? In order to observe the festivals properly, they have to work their calendar. The calendar requires that, every so often you have to add an extra month to the calculations, right? Which is Adar, all right? Some years you have one Adar, and some years you have two. And that keeps everything in its proper season. But it's not God who necessarily tells us when to organize the calendar and to add a month. Who does that? We do.
Rabbi?
We the rabbis. Yes, Shelley. You have to unmute yourself, Shelley.
Can't hear you, Shelley.
Shelley, unmute. Thank you.
Unmute.
What?
Shelley.
Go ahead.
What I think was, I don't see the problem. It's not much different than almost all the other mitzvot. If God says, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk, that's what God says. These are my times. You got to figure out what I mean by don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. I mean, so many of the mitzvot require interpretation. This one requires you making the fixed time sacred. I mean, I don't really see that this is such a fundamental problem. We can't have, it wouldn't be much of an instruction book and say, pick a day of the year and make it the new year. We'd probably still be arguing about it. By God defining, these are the times, now you make it sacred. I don't see this as such a big problem.
Well, that's because you have the benefit of reading Rashi. Rashi sees the problem and he shows you how to resolve it.
Why is that different than don't boil a kid in its mother's milk? I mean, it's like, this is what God says, you figure it out.
Well, I will say this. I think don't boil the kid in its mother's milk has a lot more added on to it than this.
How about you shall keep the Sabbath? I mean, what does that mean?
That's a good question.
You know, all of these.
We'll deal with that another night.
Okay.
So, Rashi's solution is fairly simple. Dell comments on this, the people are being instructed to proclaim the fixed times to everyone. Yes. Who is everyone? Each other. Right? It's not that they have to tell the entire world. You don't have to proclaim it to everyone. You proclaim it as a community. Next piece, let's go back to sharing this. And here is what Rashbam says, following his grandfather Rashi. Right? It says, which you shall schedule as sacred times, as sacred occasions. Proclamation of sacred occasions always refers to scheduling them. And he gives as a proof text a verse from Lamentations, that God has proclaimed a set time against me. In Lamentations, that's when all the bad things happen against us, right? But that's what it means in Lamentations. And so Rashbam says that's what it means here too. It is scheduling them, which, underscores what Rashi says about the Israelites having the responsibility not just to observe them, but to establish their calendar and schedule them appropriately. Okay. Comments or questions up to here? Okay, let's go back and look at the statement of Ramban. Right? Ramban says, the festivals are not the priest's business more than they are the business of the rest of Israel. So this section is addressed to the Israelites as a whole and not specifically to Aaron and his sons. Why do you think that Ramban feels the need to say this?
Okay, thought is that if the Israelites might think that the Kohen needs to only observe it and then they can kind of witness it. So to make sure to clarify that they know that everybody needs to observe. It's not just for the high priest.
Can you put that back up there and take another look at it?
Yeah, I'm trying to. We're just, fixing it here. Okay, here it is. Okay, Liz, was that you?
That was me.
Yeah. I got a little bit garbled. Can you explain again what you were saying?
So I think just to make it, to clarify it, and so that all of the Israelites know that, or Jews know that they are also responsible for observing. So they don't think that the Kohen is observing it in their place or
right. And why might they
representative.
think that in the context of, the Torah?
Well, the priest is the one that does certain things, and
The Kohanim do a lot of things, and
yes,
we are reading in the book of Leviticus, right? That is basically the handbook for the Kohanim. And so it's noteworthy that this is addressed to the Israelites as a whole. So Ramban doesn't want you to miss that point.
Although the last couple of Parsha were that way also.
Okay, that's fine, but here we are with the festivals, and the festivals do have certain observances, some more than others, where the Kohanim played a mighty role. Right? So, Ramban goes on, these are really holy convocations, occasions of calling, on which everyone, meaning every Jew, is called to gather and sanctify them. It is, in fact, a commandment for, and this is, Ramban's projection, since they didn't actually have synagogues back then. If you wanted to go to the house of God, where did you go? In the desert, you went to the Mishkan, and later on in Jerusalem, you went to the temple, right? He says it is, in fact, a commandment for all Jews to gather in the house of God on festival days in fresh clothing. That's significant because back in the day, how often did you wear fresh clothing?
Not very often.
Not too often. Right? So, if you wore fresh clothing once a month, that might be a lot. Right? And how many people had, more than one set of clothing? So, to do that really marks out the festival day as a special time. Right? To sanctify them publicly with prayer and praise to God, and to make them days of feasting. For our tradition applies Ezra's words on Rosh Hashanah to all the festivals in general, and he quotes the passage from Nehemiah, says, "Go, eat choice foods and drink sweet drinks, and send portions to whoever has nothing prepared." By the way, that's very significant. Even in the Bible, you can't have a festival without taking care of the people in the community who have nothing with which to observe the festival, right? It's a communal responsibility. For the day is holy to our Lord. Do not be sad, for your rejoicing in the Lord is the source of your strength. Right? So, another way of kind of fleshing out what it means to make these, to proclaim these as sacred occasions. So Barbara has a comment here in the chat. Is the people are being given the task of creating a calendar, which of course was first mentioned back in Parsha Bo. The high holidays are fixed in time. In fact, all three of the pilgrimage festivals are fixed in time. And yes, everyone is to participate in the celebrations, every member of the Jewish community. That got a little harder when the Jewish people got separated somewhat. If you went to Jerusalem to observe the festival, but maybe you didn't live in Jerusalem, or maybe you didn't even live in the land of Israel. There were a few such people then. Okay? Comments or questions up to here? All right, let's go back. And here we are. Abarbanel has another idea about this, right? Why does it, if the Israelites have to proclaim the holidays, why does it refer to them as my fixed times? Abarbanel says they are sacred to the Lord, whether Israel sanctifies them or not. This is the answer to the age-old question. If a festival falls in the forest, does anyone hear it? And the answer is yes. It is a sacred day to God, and if you don't keep it, or even if no one keeps it, still a sacred day. It's God's day. What happens if Shabbat comes and nobody observes it? What's the answer to that?
Shabbat
I'll
happens.
be very upset.
Yeah, well, there have been times like that. But, somebody else said something?
I said Shabbat happens.
Shabbat happens. It's there for you to tap into, and if you don't, it's still Shabbat. Right? It's a mitzvah to tap into it. If you don't take the mitzvah seriously, well, that is our problem. But it's not God's problem. Right? It's still.
Rabbi Demi.
Yes, Francois.
I think you bring a good point when you brought Shabbat, because you're right. Shabbat is, we have to respect it wherever we are at war or wherever the situation is. But I believe, well, from this logic, I think what God's trying to tell us here is not necessarily perhaps about the calendar, and depends on the calendar, like modification, but it's more about the appropriate time. Because, for example, we need to make sure, like, for example, it's appropriate to do the festival and be able to enjoy it rather than just celebrate it at home. Like these days, for example, like we cannot,
right.
I guess.
Right. So related to this would be the question, what happens if you make Shabbat on Tuesday? What happens if you make, let's say you went to work on Yom Kippur for whatever reason, right? You went to work on, how about observing it the next day? You just keep Yom Kippur on the 11th of Tishrei.
But it's not for us to proclaim it at this, to change the date.
Well, you proclaim it. You proclaim it as God's fixed time, and it is a fixed time. It is not subject to alteration, right? You may have heard, Francois, that in this country and even in a few places in Western Europe in the 19th century, there were Jews who said, you know what? Making Shabbat on Saturday makes us outliers in our community. We're going to have our Shabbat on Sunday. Well, I mean, yeah, it just doesn't seem Jewish, does it? But the reality is, this verse is an answer to that. It's my fixed time, says God. Same thing for Shabbat as with the festivals. You know, if you go to Reform temples, you will sometimes find that they have moved the observance of a festival such as Sukkot or Shavuot to the next Shabbat or to the previous Shabbat. And the reason for that is very simple. They figure they're going to get more people in the temple that way. Well, according to the Torah, it is God's fixed time. Don't mess with it.
But there's a big difference here because Shabbat is fixed time, and we cannot proclaim when it's going to be. As
we proclaim it by doing it.
It's fixed. It's fixed to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Other comments or questions before we go on? Okay. Please. Shelley?
This addresses a much more fundamental issue, which is, why does God need humans at all? I mean, if it's going to be sacred to the Lord, whether or not we celebrate it, what does he need us for?
And what would your answer to that be, Shelley?
Frankly, I don't have a good answer. It's God's ball game. You know, he created us. Why he fundamentally needs us is not clear to me at all.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
God spoke directly to the people once back at Sinai, and that didn't work too well.
Well, that just heightens the problem, doesn't it?
I think.
Yeah, Daniel.
My understanding of Judaism as a covenantal relationship between the Jewish people and God demands that without the existence of people, then the whole thing falls apart. I mean, I guess you could argue, you know, what's the point in having a Jewish people? But assuming that we are there, if we don't have a covenantal relationship, then the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Okay.
I don't think I'm understanding the question.
I think you're right, Daniel. The problem is, you know, it just sort of, you know, pushes off the question a little bit. Why the need for God to have a covenantal people?
Okay. I get the question now. I was looking at it backwards.
Uh-huh. Anybody else want to take a crack at that? Because that's a powerful question Shelley's asking.
Well, I mean, I think to spread the word, I mean, that's part of it. God can't talk to everyone, and if you set up kind of a group that can kind of model what he wants, then maybe other people will follow that modeling behavior.
Mm-hmm. That's a mighty responsibility, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, isn't that the whole idea of not being special, but it's chosen to be able to bring in this an ethical monotheistic way of living life.
Chosen for a responsibility. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help you any yet, Shelley?
No.
Why not? Isn't that a good thing?
I'm waiting for a good answer. I mean, it's a fundamental question. It almost defies an answer. God's all powerful, all knowing. What does he need us for? He goes on and on and on.
I would dispute that God is all powerful. I think the Bible doesn't necessarily claim that. God is powerful, but maybe not all powerful.
Take your thought experiment. Nobody celebrates Shabbat. Does God die? Does God go away? Does God cry? Does God, what happens if we all did that? None of us celebrate Shabbat. What happens? God says,
but Shelley, we run afoul of the idea that we are bound by a covenant, and that if you remember, if we misbehave, God says there's going to be very severe problems, but part of the covenant is to become holy like God is holy, and we must share the sacred times with him so that we fulfill our part of the bargain.
But the fundamental question is, why does God need a covenant with us? What does he need us for? Yeah, all that's true. If you sign up for covenant, well, you have responsibilities. But why does God need a covenant with us?
Well, I think Liz offers at least a partial solution to that. God needs a covenant because he needs people to help bring about the world that he wants.
I mean, so God has needs?
That doesn't trouble me at all. But that's only because I've studied enough of mainline Kabbalah to where that's just taken for granted that God has needs.
I mean, isn't the whole... I'm sorry, Shelley.
Yeah, some people, may take a more philosophical approach and they start with a different assumption. If you don't start with the assumption that God has no needs, that God is all powerful, if you don't share those assumptions, you don't have so many problems.
But the covenant started with Abraham. And correct?
Yes.
And so because Abraham, and this is kind of like one of the explanations in my mind. Since Abraham found God with his own mind, okay, this is where the covenant actually established, like by having this relationship that Abraham initiated with God, by looking for him and finding him and establish this relationship. This is where God decided to have covenant with Abraham and his seeds. And the goal is so we can have a relationship. I don't know. This is where I can stop, but I guess this is kind of like I'm trying to guide here some seeds. Hopefully it will go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Others? Someone else wants to comment on this? Yeah, Anna.
I just wondered, so if God didn't have us, who would express his story? He wants to, he has these fixed times, he has these festivals, but without us to actually be mindful of God, there's no reflection of God. So again, it feels like it does come out of his need to make himself known and manifest.
Yes. Yes, Shelley.
Another question that comes from your answer is, if God is not all powerful and all knowing, why should we listen to him? If you don't believe God is God, why listen? Why pay attention to the Torah?
No. Just because God is not all powerful does not mean that God is not God. Doesn't mean God isn't the creator.
It's got to be more than a creator, because he gave us this instruction manual, the Torah, which we all attempt to follow. But why attempt to follow if it's not accurate? If it's not really a good instruction manual coming from the ultimate source of knowledge, for example. This is the way you should live your life. If you don't believe that,
there is something different between God being all-powerful and God being the source of knowledge. Del, you're trying to say something.
Abraham was not the first covenant. There was at least a covenant with Noah, and between Noah and Abraham, it got forgotten or ignored, and then God started over with Abraham, and we see in the Torah where God was upset with the people and ready to start over with Moses. And as far as the Torah being an instruction manual, it doesn't matter if God is all powerful or not, it's still a proper and correct instruction manual. Just like a proper instruction manual for working on a vehicle.
Okay. So it's not a problem for me, but I guess this is a problem for Shelley.
Yeah, I'd say it's a problem. I mean, these are fundamental issues. I mean, you start with this question, these are my fixed times, you have to proclaim them as sacred. Well, why does God need us to do that? How does God benefit? If you say God has needs, how does he benefit from us proclaiming them as sacred?
Maybe because he just wants us to keep the word alive. Maybe God needs a people.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking. It seems that God does need a people, but for
Yes.
what?
But for what? Well, yeah, Daniel.
What's in it for God, so to speak?
To exist, if God was, if you want to put it as if we're talking about a real being, if he was all by himself, what's the point in living? Mm-hmm. If he doesn't have a partner in exercising his existence, I mean, why would he even be there? I mean, he needs an object of his creativity.
Daniel, is God lonely?
Not when we're here. If we weren't here, I'm sure he would be. He would have to search for us, to quote a certain gentleman that I like, a philosopher.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, to me, it's a fundamental. I guess you could say, why does God need to exist? And I could make a very good argument that he doesn't, and therefore, that there is no point in anything. But assuming that there is a God, I cannot imagine that God being there without a partner in expressing himself or herself. Maybe I'm just being a little shallow here and not understanding the question.
I don't think it's shallow, but let me throw another question at you about this, and that is, so we Jews have a covenant with God. Do non-Jews have a different covenant with God?
If you're asking me, I think so. Yeah, we are chosen to be Jews. We aren't chosen to be all that special personally. I mean, we have a role in our relationship with God, and so do Muslims, and so does every individual on earth. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, Francois.
No, I don't believe they have covenant with God. But, one thing I was going to say, it's like a king. You need to have people believe in you and kind of like feel you so you can be a king. But if you don't have those people, you cannot be a king, and king can be like, king and more. But the same thing with us. I mean, we need to exist.
Yeah, what is the king without subjects?
Exactly.
Yeah, the rabbis asked that question too. That's for many of the rabbis, I think that is their answer to Shelley's question. So let's go a little farther on our study guide. And here's the teaching of Sforno, who says, on Sabbaths and festivals alike, you must occupy yourselves with study of Torah and other holy things. If instead you occupy yourselves with weekday affairs and human pleasures alone, hint, hint, kiddush, they are not my fixed times, but yours. In that case, he quotes the famous verse from Isaiah, your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. So it's up to us to make them into special days by doing certain special things. If Friday night is only Shabbat dinner because that's when we that's when we eat, that's when we have a big meal, well, that's not the Shabbat, says Sforno, that God is talking about. You have to proclaim it in some other ways as well. Dell asks me, is there another people that believes they have a covenant? Well, the answer to that is yes. I mean, the Christians believe they have superseded the Jewish covenant. The Muslims believe they have the covenant. I don't know if we can all be right, but maybe everyone has a covenant that is more than our collective understanding. Okay, so someone else have a comment here? Okay, so let's go on. And this next piece is from one of Sforno's students, right, who wrote a book about his, his Rebbe's teachings, right? And he says, in the preceding verses, the Torah discusses the holiness of the Kohanim who bring sacrifices on the altar, how they must distance themselves from impurity. And now the Torah teaches that every Jew can have a relationship with God. How so? The Torah calls the festivals Mikra'e Kodesh, holy convocations or gatherings. On the festivals, all the Jewish people are called upon to gather in the presence of Torah scholars and reverend people in order to be inspired and uplifted. When we do this, rather than spending the entire festival indulging in food and drink, God declares, these are my fixed times. Right? So there has to be something a little bigger than just what's in the festival for us. And I think this is one of the big problems with Judaism in modern times, particularly in America. We tend to ask the question, what's in religion for us? What's in it for me? What's it going to do for my family, my children, my marriage? What's in it for me? So maybe the question should be, what's in it for God? And then we try to follow after that. Now, if you have no problem with that, then maybe you've gone farther off the deep end than I have. Do you like that, Daniel? Okay. Next. this is from the Talmud. All right? Our rabbis taught, once the heavens were covered with clouds and the likeness of the moon was seen on the 29th of the month, the public were minded to declare a new moon, and the Beit Din wanted to sanctify it. Rabban Gamliel said to them, I have it on the authority of the house of my father's father, that the renewal of the moon takes place after not less than 29 days and a half and 2/3 of an hour and 73 parts. He's pretty careful. And on that day, the mother of Ben Zaza died, and Rabban Gamliel made a great funeral oration over her. Not because she had merited it, but so that the public should know that the Beit Din had not sanctified the month. So, you know, there are some objective criteria for the days, for the festival days, but there's also a human part to it. And then we also see, this is the continuation of the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva went and found Rabbi Joshua while he was in great distress. He said to him, Master, why are you in distress? He replied, Akiva, let's go back here. Akiva, it were better for a man to be on a sickbed for 12 months than that such an injunction should be laid on him. Right? Now, what was he referring to? Rabban Gamliel had decreed that Rabbi Joshua appear before him with his staff and purse on the day that Rabbi Joshua reckoned to be Yom Kippur. Needless to say, there was a little bit of a dispute over this and also over how Rabban Gamliel handled it. But Rabban Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, and you didn't mess with him. So even Rabbi Joshua, even if he disagreed with him, he did it anyway. But he says, better to be sick for a year than to have to keep Yom Kippur on the wrong day and not keep it on what I think is the right day. So Akiva said to him, will you allow me to tell you something you yourself have taught me? And he said to him, speak. Said to him, the text says, you, 3 times to indicate you may fix the festivals, even if you err inadvertently, you, even if you err deliberately, you, even if you are misled. And he replied to him, Akiba, you have comforted me. You have comforted me. Right? So, again, another suggestion as to why we have this shared responsibility, right? Because there are so many times when it says you, right? You shall keep this. You shall set this. You shall observe this. Right? But that also, that gives some leeway even for mistakes. Right? So that's the outcome of the Talmud. Comments or questions here? Okay. Next piece from a contemporary rabbi writer, Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky. Why does it say my fixed times and then say you shall proclaim them? Just so you know, a lot of rabbis did notice this problem. He says, even though the sages had great power in establishing the festivals, God reaffirms that the holidays belong to God. We need to be careful and not humanize it too much. It would be a mistake to make Passover the festival of freedom from physical slavery without emphasizing spiritual liberation, or to make Sukkot, like many people, some people have suggested in modern times, the holiday of the homeless, and forget the Ananei Kavod, the spiritual clouds of glory accompanying the Israelites on their wanderings, or to make Shavuot a celebration of intellectual achievement rather than a time when we receive the Torah. So here's another approach to the problem, my fixed times that you shall proclaim, right? So you look at it from the human perspective and remember that even though you have to proclaim them, they are God's fixed times with God's own fixed purposes associated with them. Okay. Comments or questions here? Next, yet another teaching that begins with the question, why does it say my fixed times? And then you shall proclaim them. Proclaim also means call. The festivals call and draw us to a higher level.
Rabbi, can you pull up the text?
Sorry?
Can you pull up the text?
I'm gonna do that again. I'm sort of going back and forth because I want to be able to see people, but so it says, proclaim also means call, right? It comes from the root kara, which sometimes means to read, but also means to call, right? So again, this is from God's perspective. You shall proclaim them, meaning you shall hear the call, be drawn to a higher level of holiness. So from this standpoint, it's about us. It's about how the festivals might force us to grow, right? All right, let me put this out. Other comments or questions up to here? Okay, so let me just give you the one piece from Samson Raphael Hirsch, and then there's a long piece which you can read at home if you like. So this is not the correct piece. Hold on. That's not right. Let me pull up another one. Let me see if this is the right piece.
I can read it if you want me to.
I just want to put it in front of everybody. Yeah, okay, here it is. And now let's try and share it. Not sure why that wasn't on the other sheet, but here it is. Okay, so it says, nothing marks a person's independence so much as their unfettered right to the disposition of their time. While we may freely give control of our time to God in observance of the festivals, ceding our schedule to others is a tacit admission of what we are not able to do for ourselves. Both concepts, the need for order and the need to be stewards of our time, speak to our need to believe that we have some control over our existence in a chaotic world. So Hirsch wants to make the point that this is part of what it means to be a free Jewish people, is to be able to freely give our time to God. Okay? And it's our choice. If we didn't have the choice, we wouldn't really be sanctifying the day. We wouldn't be hearing the call. We would just be filling in and, doing what the master says because the master says so. How does this relate to Shelley's question of the covenant? From what I would say is that the covenant has to be chosen. Right? We continue to re-choose the covenant constantly. We reaffirm the covenant regularly. Without that, we're just, doing what we have to do. Yes, Shelley.
Well, Samson Raphael Hirsch's statement almost sounds like God is a creation of man from our needs, that we need a God, something to give us the appearance of some order in an otherwise chaotic world. I don't think that's what he intended, but it sure sounds that way.
No, I don't think it's what he intended either. I think he intends to emphasize the independence of human beings. So here we are, just a few weeks from Shavuot, and I guess we're left with the question of how do we sanctify the festival? How do we proclaim the day in a way that renews the covenant, that fulfills some of the purposes that we've talked about here? And how do we do that regularly with every festival?
Are you suggesting that blintzes aren't enough?
Ice cream.
Shelley, they may do a lot for you, and I'm not against blintzes. It may just not quite be enough. You can have blintzes tonight if you want. You're not convinced by that.
No, I mean,
Isn't this where ritual comes
I don't
in?
even like blintzes, to tell you the truth, but.
Oh, okay. What, Barbara, was that you?
That was me.
Yeah, please.
But in some respects, this is where ritual comes into play, because ritual sets which you want to call it, the procedures for bringing God into the covenant, and not just the commercialism of the blintzes or the Luxon Kogel or whatever it is that is associated with your family traditions. Part of that tradition has to include going to the synagogue, celebrating in a fashion to glorify God and to re-accept the covenant and to understand what it is that we're celebrating. And the rest of it is fluff. And that's unfortunately what's happened to a lot of our holidays. We have commercialized them, if you will, and made fun things. And we have to be constantly reminded of what is the underlying underpinnings of that particular festival.
Yes. So our challenge this year is to do it without being able to come to synagogue. So, yes, we will have virtual services, and yes, we will have, virtual classes, and there'll be plenty of things in advance of Shavuot. But I think the challenge that we all have to answer is, you know, what's the best way for us to do that under our current circumstances? And then, you know, maybe that will motivate us to do a little more to build that into our lives in the future when the opportunity is given back to us. So with all of that, thank you very much, and hope to see you all next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yep.